We're going to honor a very special person tonight. But first, I'd like to introduce and bring to the podium Lise Gottel, who is the board chair of LEAF. Lise?
Thank you, Donna, and for your wonderful work emceeing tonight. Sandra Shamus is a pretty hard act to follow. I'm not as funny as she is. Thank you for coming tonight to support LEAF's long-standing work. We've had a very successful year. We played a pivotal role in the Canadian Judicial Council inquiry into the conduct of Knees Together Judge Robin Camp. We've been involved in several cases that address the ongoing injustices against Indigenous women. LEAF has also done some important work in the area of sexual assault law, leading to appellate decisions that advance substantive equality and complainant rights. And we're working on a number of new cases in the areas of social assistance, pay equity, and sexual assault. Often, we work in collaboration with other women's groups and social justice organizations. Our success depends upon the talent and commitment of our very wonderful LEAF staff. It also depends upon a large and incredible group of volunteers from coast to coast, the lawyers, activists, and academics who donate their time and expertise to the work of making equality real for Canadian women and girls. And critically, LEAF's success is due to the generosity of donors like you. For the past 32 years, LEAF has been a collective project that has involved thousands of donors and volunteers from across the country. Tonight, we honor the Honorable Nancy Ruth for her singular and outstanding contributions to LEAF. Nancy Ruth has really been LEAF's best friend for more than 3 decades. She was a founding mother, an important member of that group of visionary activist women who, in the early 1980s, were determined to make sure that the new Charter of Rights and Freedoms would deliver on the promise of equality for women and girls. Nancy worked diligently to get LEAF off the ground in those early years. In fact, LEAF was formed at a meeting at her house. Nancy has been LEAF's most generous donor, and certainly was in those formative years in particular. She chaired the fundraising committee. She solicited others to support this new initiative. And she was the driving force behind the establishment of the LEAF Foundation. Her foresight in pushing LEAF to take this step has helped to ensure LEAF's survival over the years, and in particular through the difficult years in which the global economic recession and anti-equality governments ate away at LEAF's resources. Nancy has always been generous with her advice and assistance over these many years, especially in raising the funds that LEAF needs to do its important equality work. She's shared her contacts, her financial acumen, her wealth of experience in the world of business and finance, and especially her incredibly broad and deep roots in the Canadian women's movement. But equally important, she's always pushed LEAF hard to develop our own survival skills. She urged us to understand what motivates donors, to improve our communications with supporters, and to get over our inhibitions about money and to recognize that, at least when it comes to finding the resources we need to do our work, the goddess helps those who help themselves. Those of you who've worked with Nancy will understand that she hasn't hesitated to give LEAF the sharp side of her tongue when we've stumbled from time to time over the years. But she's always been there to help us get back on our feet. Her deep commitment and support for LEAF's work has never, ever wavered. And now she has finally allowed us to honor her, and believe me, that was not an easy thing to convince her of. LEAF is delighted to have this opportunity to honor Nancy Ruth for her work in advancing women's equality through the project of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. This award expresses our deep gratitude for all that she has given to us over the years. Her commitment, first and foremost, to making equality real, for her hard work, her wisdom, and her incredible generosity. We look forward to many future years of working together. And now I'd like to call upon the Honorable Margaret Norrie McCain, one of Nancy's dearest friends and a supreme sponsor of tonight's gala. Ms. McCain will present the award to Nancy.
So good evening, everyone, and most of all, good evening, Nancy. Nancy, you've been a fearless force for women. You knew what women needed often before they knew it themselves, and you went for it in a way that was fearless and in areas where most of us would be intimidated to go. You shook the bushes, you poked the bears, and you went, as I said, where the rest of us were afraid to tread. But let me tell you about the first time I met Nancy. I was living in New Brunswick, and I was raising money for the Muriel McQueen Ferguson Foundation, a research center, and someone suggested, I think you need to go and see Nancy Ruth. So I put on my best lady who lunches suit because I was from New Brunswick, rural New Brunswick, and I wanted to make an impression. And I got my hair well done, and I arrived at Nancy's home. She welcomed me at the door and ushered me into the kitchen and showed me the stool to sit on. And then she gave me a cup of tea in a mug and apologized, saying that her mother would be shocked that she did this. Then she introduced me to her cat. His name was Venus castratus. That gave me a flavor of Nancy. And written all over Nancy's face was, where the hell did this woman come from? What the hell does she know about family violence? But after many very insightful and penetrating questions, I left, wondering what had just happened. But I did learn that Nancy does not suffer fools gladly, and she doesn't waste time with them either. But I think I passed the test, because very soon we got a check in the mail. Thank you, Nancy. That research center is still thriving after 30 years. More importantly, from that first meeting, I earned her respect and enduring friendship. And I also learned to respect you, Nancy, and to have deep affection for you. I've admired you ever since that very first meeting, and I value our friendship very, very highly. Nancy has made transformational, strategic investments in areas that have permanently impacted women's lives across Canada, and not just with LEAF. It has made Canada a leader in women's place in society. She was a founder of the Canadian Women's Foundation, Women's Television, an enormous donor for years to Women's College Hospital. But most importantly, she has been the founder and a huge donor to LEAF, which is an organization where behaviors and attitudes towards women were transformed into the law, where it truly counts and impacts women's lives. So Nancy, I want to say, for me, for my daughters, for my granddaughters, and my soon-to-arrive great-granddaughter, for all Canadian women, I thank you. I want to bless you as you continue your work to make women's lives better. Thank you. Well, that was fun. Venus castratus, that's not a bad name for a cat, eh? Well, thank you all very much. Thank you for coming. It's lovely to see old faces, and this room is full of all kinds of people I have never seen before. So I am very pleased to be here. This hall is also full of lieutenant governors, comedians, and good, strong women and men who like to take leadership. So again, thank you for coming. Now, I'm legally blind, so I have big type on my pages, and I've got 40 odd of them here, so it'll take me a bit of time to shuffle, but be patient. So LEAF is the organization you're supporting, and I'm so glad you do. But most of you don't know that LEAF's history, or why I'm up here tonight. So I'm going to tell you a story, and there's no light on the podium, so here we go. I need you to hang in for 7 minutes. Get a stool if you haven't got one. There are 3 points I'm going to make. Good preacher that I am. The first one is that in the 1970s and 80s, there was a cohesive women's movement. It was experienced and knowledgeable, and who knew how difficult and systemic change was to make. Secondly, it wasn't just the legal academic community who were organizing and thinking and so on. It was also the grassroots level people who stepped up and took responsibility for thinking and doing things. And thirdly, we asked, would the Charter do the job? The report of the 1970 Royal Commission on the Status of Women didn't do. Would we get it right in 1980 or not? My story with the Constitution and LEAF starts in 1981 at the Cow Cafe, where angry feminists met for lunch. And there's some of those angry feminists here tonight. One of them is Linda Nye, and another is Senator Mary Lou McPhedran, so thank you both for coming. We were really pissed off. We were pissed off at Lloyd Axworthy, the Minister of Women at the time, telling us that women couldn't have a say in Canada's Constitution. This lunch was the key launching event for the February 1981 Ad Hoc Conference on Women and the Constitution. On October the 6th, 1980, the first Prime Minister Trudeau tabled the first version of the Canada Act and its schedule for the Constitution Act. Women were curious and engaged. What would the Charter mean for women's equality? Would it help? Would it hinder? The press canvassed human rights experts on this question, but they were all male. They had good things to say about the Charter in Section 15, but the press didn't ask for our opinion. And thanks to the advanced work of Bev Baines and Mary Eberts, working with the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women, we knew that the Charter, as it then was bad news. And we had to get that message out. We knew that if women weren't going to be asked to join the party, we were going to crash the party. And we did. When the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women appeared before the Parliamentary Committee in November 1980, our submission was our roadmap. It was our GPS. It was supported by the 18 study papers. The Council proposed new wording for Section 15 and other provisions of the Charter, and these changes became our political objective. The government offered a retread. The wording from the Canadian Bill of Rights that the Supreme Court of Canada had applied to the detriment of women. Women like Laval and Bedard and Bliss. We spoke out. We spoke to women's groups all across the country. They wanted information and analysis, and they wanted to know what was going on. Expertise grew. Many lawyers, law professors, law students became knowledgeable and engaged, and they taught the women's groups in their areas how and to interpret the Charter for us and what was needed in the changes to the Charter.
That gave us experts in every province and territory of this country. Politicians of all stripes heard from us, and they heard early on in the process. We knew after the 1981 ad hoc conference that we would have to do more. It wasn't enough just to hold the conference and get the press. Nothing would be given in respect to women's equality. We would have to take it. And this is still true today. And it's why I gotta say this for all the senators in the room, and there are at least two of them, we do not have a national anthem that includes all of us. For goodness sake, email your senators tomorrow and tell them to vote on the O Canada bill that includes all of us in our national anthem. They can't get the bill to the vote. That's the issue now. It's not that the votes aren't there to pass it, which is why the Conservative senators are blocking it with their amendments and sub-amendments. They just won't let it get to the vote. So bang on those keys tomorrow. And I'm Nancy.Ruth at Simpatico if you want an email of all the senators' lists. Okay. Just to take you back in history a wee bit, but do some of you remember the photograph of Queen Elizabeth and Papa Trudeau and Chrétien signing the Constitution? Remember that out in front of the Parliament buildings? Well, after the Queen signed our Constitution, there was a 3-year moratorium on our equality rights. Why, you might ask? Because the governments, the provinces, and so on, and the municipalities said they needed 3 years to get their house in order. Well, they didn't want to be challenged in the court right away, and so they got their 3 years. But that meant we had 3 years too. So how could we use that time? Well, there were 6 national initiatives that came out of this thinking. The first was the Canadian Advisory Council in May 1982 hired 4 women to go down to the USA and do some research on what legal defense funds looked like and come up with a suggestion for charter litigation. Well, they wrote their report, and because it had to be translated, it didn't get published until 1984. And I used to say to Mary Lou McFedrin with quite regularity, why won't they tell us what they're saying? And she'd give me all this stuff about confidentiality, and they were under contract to a government department, and they couldn't do it. Well, darn. So some of us activists couldn't wait that long, and we started organizing and incorporating LEAF in Beth Syme's office. The second national initiative was a weekend workshop at City Hall in May 1982. We talked about interpreting the Charter to work for women, identifying resources, thinking about legal action funds, writing authorities, because we couldn't go to court without our authorities. And we knew we had to go to court because somebody had to teach the judges. The third national strategy that came, well, one of the consequences of that City Hall meeting was that a lot of the academics and folk that were there were told to go off and write. Create the authorities that we need. Just do it. And they did it. Okay, the third national initiative was a conference held on equality rights at what was then known as the Park Plaza Hotel, and I don't know what it's called now, the Hyatt or something. Anyhow, that was in January 1985. Now, the charter, the equality section of the charter was coming into effect in April 17th, which is the day LEAF started its mumbo jumbo, right? So, January 1985, what we did was we pulled together all the decision makers, the lawyers, the judges, the prosecutors, the legal administrators, governments, and a bunch of others, highfalutin folk, you know, deputy ministers and so on. But the conference was designed by the same feminists who've been working for 3 years on this issue. They controlled the agenda, and they controlled the speakers, and they controlled the publication that came out of that conference, which was the authority on how the charter should be interpreted when we went to court in April 1985. The fourth national initiative was a conference for women's groups, because women's groups needed to know what the charter meant for them. The National Action Committee held a conference, and the Charter of Rights Coalition was established. That's where I came in, because I ran that group. CORC was a coalition of 17 national women's groups We created a slide tape show, and we sent it across the country to all the membership chapters, all these national groups like the Y, the Jewish organizations, everybody, Federation of University Women's, the EFTAO, or the FWTAO as it was then. They all had chapters across the country, and we pushed this thing right out. So there were hundreds of thousands of women who knew what it was that women needed in the Charter. But there was a second thing that these groups did. They lobbied the provincial attorneys general, telling them what needed changing. They knew what to tell them because our fifth strategy was to do what was called statute audits. Audits of governments, regulations, governments' laws, all that stuff. We were looking at the examples of facial discrimination. We knew they were doing things like changing workmen's compensation to workers' compensation, but they weren't doing anything substantive, and we didn't like that. So the lawyers and the students, the law students, were just absolutely invaluable, did all this research, put it together in a way that could be used, and this research was sent province by province to the women's groups, who then sent their little lobby groups off to the attorney generals, and that's how we did it. And it's, you know what? We can do it again. Beth Atchison undertook a great deal of these audits, both federal and in the province of Ontario, and they happened in Manitoba and BC. Now, the sixth national initiative was the launching of LEAF and our power in helping to interpret Canada's Charter of Rights. We were ready. We knew what the law should be. We had written the authorities. We had hundreds of thousands of women across Canada excuse me, who cared, and we were in court on April the 17th in the Yukon in 1985. Each one of you here are continuing LEAF's extraordinary 32-year history. And I'll tell you, it's nice to stand up here, maybe 35 years later after that constitutional conference, and see all of you supporting LEAF. Change happens because it's made to happen. It's made to happen by us. Thank you all very much. Go be a change agent. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy Ruth. We love you. And so wonderful to honor you tonight. And thank you for, as Lise was saying, thank you for allowing us to honor you, because LEAF has wanted to do this for a very long time. So this is a very special evening for everybody here. So our party continues. Don't forget to get your photos taken. If I can say one thing, since this is a fundraiser, thank you so much for being here, for supporting us, for being a sponsor or purchasing a ticket. And when you leave, you will get a small package, and there will be a donor form. The Goddess helps those who help themselves, and we very much appreciate if you would put LEAF on your donor list for donations this year, in addition to your attending this event. Thank you so much. We're going to continue our party till at least 9 or later. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.